Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful and, yeah, pretty controversial vision for the soul of Europe. It comes from the theologian Joseph Ratzinger, the man who would later become Pope Benedict XVI. It's a story all about identity, a deep crisis, and a potential path to rescue.
But our story doesn't kick off in the 20th century. Nope, it starts way back in ancient myth, the abduction of Europa, this beautiful maiden lured away from her home. Ratzinger grabs this powerful image and uses it as a metaphor for the entire continent that, well, bears her name.
And that's really the big question for us, isn't it? How on earth does this ancient myth connect to a modern diagnosis of Europe's spiritual and cultural health? Well, let's unpack it.
To understand the kidnapping, first, we've got to understand who or what is being kidnapped. So what did Ratzinger actually see as the true, beautiful Europe? See, for Ratzinger, Europe isn't just a place on a map. You can't just draw a line from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains and say, there it is. He argued it's a shared cultural and historical idea. It's a concept, something forged over a long, long time.
And that concept? He says it's built on a really specific foundation, this synthesis of two completely different worlds. On one side, you've got Athens, the Greek spirit, all about rationality and philosophy. And on the other, you have Jerusalem, the faith of Israel, bringing monotheism and this incredibly powerful ethical framework.
And that right there, that's his core argument in a nutshell. This unique blend of Greek reason and Judeo-Christian faith isn't just, a part of Europe. For Ratzinger, it is Europe. It's the spiritual DNA of the whole continent, and you can't get rid of it. Okay, so if that's Europe's identity, then who are the kidnappers in this story? Ratzinger pointed to two major forces that he believed were basically pulling the continent away from these very foundations. He identified two main challenges. First, what he saw as a challenge from Islam. And second, a challenge from the inside, a kind of radical secularism that he thought had completely lost its way. So let's look at that first challenge. Writing way back in 1979, Ratzinger argued that a traditional Islamic framework doesn't separate faith and civil law, and that creates this fundamental tension with the secular state model. He said when the Quran is also the ultimate legal text, it just doesn't mesh with the European tradition. Now, it's really important to note, the source material points out he would later soften this view, putting more emphasis on dialogue and shared values.
The second kidnapper, he argues, is a lot more subtle, and it comes from within Europe itself. It all gets started with what he called a confused ideology of freedom.
What he meant was, this ideology takes amazing modern values like reason and freedom, and it cuts them off from their historical and spiritual anchors, specifically a respect for God and the whole idea of objective, fundamental ethical truths.
And the end result of that whole process, according to his argument, you get a complete subversion of values. What was once considered moral just becomes debatable. The very foundations of society start to feel unstable because they aren't anchored to anything permanent anymore.
So, if Europe has been kidnapped, is a rescue even possible? Ratzinger believed it was, but he said it required a very specific and a very deliberate path forward. He actually laid out a pretty clear three-step plan. And this is interesting. It's not about turning back the clock. It's about securing the best parts of the modern age by reconnecting them to their roots. And this is absolutely crucial. Ratzinger was not arguing against modernity. His vision explicitly calls for upholding and even developing its greatest achievements, things like freedom of conscience, human rights, and scientific freedom. He saw these as totally essential. But here's the absolute core of his solution. He said these modern values just can't survive on their own. To keep them from collapsing into that subversion of values, they have to be re-anchored in the very tradition that gave birth to them in the first place. The third step is all about limits. The state, he says, has to be secular or profane. It cannot become a new religion. It is not the ultimate source of what's right and what's wrong, because when it tries to be, it oversteps its bounds, and well, that's when it risks becoming tyrannical. And this all leads to his ultimate conclusion. For Ratzinger, a transcendent moral authority, God, is the final guarantor of human rights and the rule of law. Without that, he argues, our rights just become dependent on the will of whoever happens to be the most powerful at the moment.
And so we end right where we began, with that image of Europa, adrift at sea. Ratzinger's final challenge is really a question for the continent itself. To find your future, do you need to stop, turn around, and maybe start paddling back toward the shore you left behind?